The Galactic Council's main chamber was a marvel of engineering, an amphitheater of seamless alloy and shimmering force fields, orbiting the diplomatic hub world of Zephyr Prime. Towering banners of each member species floated in midair, displaying their crests in rotating holographic projections. The air was thick with the sense of alien atmospheres, carefully filtered by the environmental regulators to keep the oxygen-breathing delegates from passing out next to their methane-dependent counterparts. It was a place where the fate of entire worlds was decided with words, diplomacy, and, on the rare occasion, thinly veiled threats of planetary bombardment. Today's session, however, had taken a turn for the absurd. Madeline Carver stood at the central podium, staring down an 8-foot-tall Zalvioti warrior who had just declared, with absolute confidence, that Earth's women feared war. The silence that followed was not just awkward, it was suffocating. Even the gelatinous ambassadors of the blown, who rarely paid much attention to bipedal disputes, stopped their slow, pulsing movements to listen. The aquatic representatives of the Oracy swiveled their eye stalks toward the center of the chamber. Madeline was still processing the sheer gall of the statement. She had come prepared for the usual diplomatic wrangling. Funding negotiations, security agreements, maybe some passive-aggressive commentary on humanity's relatively new status in the interstellar community. What she had not expected was an outright dismissal of half her species. She inhaled through her nose, steadying herself. High Marshal Torvax of the Zalvioti stood across from her, his chitinous arms crossed over his broad chest, mandibles twitching in what she could only assume was amusement. His carapace was a deep shade of midnight, edged with streaks of silver that denoted his military rank. The Zalvioti were an empire of warriors, their society structured around combat and conquest. To them, war was not just a necessity, it was a way of life. The historical records are quite clear, Torvax continued, his voice carrying through the chamber like the grinding of stone. Humanity has long placed its females in a position of safety, away from battle. It is only logical that they remain unprepared for war. Madeline's fingers flexed at her sides. The old anger, the kind she had learned to temper over years in diplomacy, coiled in her chest. She didn't take the bait immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch. She had learned early in her career that silence was a weapon, one often more effective than shouting. She turned her gaze across the chamber, making eye contact with representatives from dozens of worlds. Some skeptical, some intrigued, a few downright furious on her behalf. The Rolthari matriarchs, in particular, looked deeply offended. Their queen general had personally led armies that had burned entire fleets out of the sky. Finally she spoke. "Let me see if I understand you correctly, High Marshal." Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable sharpness beneath it, like the edge of a well-honed blade. "You believe that because human women have historically been placed in positions of safety, we are inherently fearful of war." Torvax clicked his mandibles. "It is not belief. It is fact." She exhaled through her nose. "And this fact is your justification for questioning Earth's request for increased military support?" "It is relevant," he replied. "A species that does not cultivate strength in all its members is a liability. If war comes to your world, I have no doubt your men will fight bravely." He tilted his head. "But the women? They will flee. Or worse, become burdens." There was a beat of silence. Then laughter. Not from Madeline, but from one of the Giovanni representatives, a serpentine being coiled within its hover throne. Its shimmering scales rippled in amusement. "You have made a grave mistake, Zalvioti," the Giovanni murmured. "You have underestimated a human." Torvax bristled, but Madeline ignored him. She raised her hand and with a flick of her fingers, activated the holographic display at her podium. Light shimmered into existence, forming a cascade of images that filled the chamber with a golden glow. "Since the High Marshal seems so interested in Earth's history," she said, "allow me to share a few corrections." The first image appeared, Joan of Arc, clad in armor, leading French forces against the English. Another flick. The Soviet night witches, women who flew in near silence, dropping bombs on Nazi positions before vanishing into the darkness. Another flick. The Dahomey Amazons, an all-female military regiment that had once terrified European invaders with their relentless ferocity. Another flick. Women of modern militaries leading troops, piloting fighter jets, commanding fleets. Madeline let the images linger, watching as the expressions of various council members shifted. Some nodded in approval. Others, Torvax included, looked less certain than they had before. Human women have fought in every war we have ever waged, she said, her voice unwavering. Not because they were forced to, not because they had no choice, but because they chose to. She took a step forward, her gaze never leaving Torvax. And let me tell you something, High Marshal. We don't fear war. We win wars. The chamber was utterly silent. Then chaos. Voices rose at once, some in agreement, others in protest. The representatives of the more warlike species seemed either impressed or deeply irritated. The Rulthari matriarchs chittered approvingly, while the Blown let out a low, bubbling murmur of uncertainty. Torvax was staring at her now, mandibles slightly parted. This is merely rhetoric, he said after a long pause. Words and images. Nothing more. Madeline opened her mouth to reply, and then the alarms blared. A deep reverberating tone echoed through the chamber, followed by the cold, artificial voice of the security AI. Emergency alert. Unidentified hostile fleet detected at the edge of council space. High threat incursion. All military forces to defensive positions. Every holographic display in the chamber flickered, shifting to show the incoming fleet. Dozens of ships, their hulls marked with unknown insignias, approaching at high speed. Energy readings spiked as weapons systems powered up. Panic erupted. Council members shouted over one another, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of confusion. Some called for an immediate retreat. Others demanded to know who the attackers were. Madeline's hands clenched into fists. Torvax turned to her, his previous arrogance replaced by something more calculating. It appears we will soon see if your words hold merit, human. Madeline exhaled slowly. Oh, you'll see, she said. Because if there was one thing she knew for certain, it was this. War had come. And Earth's women did not run. The Galactic Council's chamber was no longer a place of debate. It was a war room. The holographic displays that once showed planetary alliances and trade routes were now filled with tactical readouts of the incoming enemy fleet. The unidentified warships burned through the outer perimeter of Council space, tearing apart automated defense stations as they advanced. Their hulls gleamed with dark, unfamiliar alloys, and their weapons systems pulsed with eerie, crimson energy signatures. Inside the chamber, panic reigned. Representatives from dozens of species spoke over one another in a frenzy of fear and confusion. Some demanded immediate retreat to their homeworlds. Others insisted on negotiating with the attackers, while the warlike species debated launching a preemptive strike. The sound of 100 different languages filled the vast hall, a cacophony of uncertainty and dread. Madeline Carver stood at the center of it all, watching, calculating. Beside her, High Marshal Torvax loomed, his many-faceted eyes fixed on the holographic projections. His mandibles twitched, his body tensed in a way that suggested he was eager for a fight. So much for diplomacy, he muttered. Madeline didn't respond immediately. She was too busy scanning the fleet readouts, her mind piecing together the puzzle at an alarming speed. Whoever these invaders were, they were fast, coordinated, and highly advanced. They had torn through automated defenses with terrifying efficiency, and now, they were less than an hour from reaching the core systems of Council space. The entire galaxy was about to change. She exhaled slowly. There was no time for hesitation. Marshal, she said, turning to Torvax. Are your forces ready? He let out a deep, rumbling click of amusement. The Zalvioti are always ready for war. Good, she said. Because we're going to need them. Torvax narrowed his eyes. You think we should engage now? Without gathering our forces? Not engage. Stall. Madeline turned to the Central Command Terminal and pulled up a three-dimensional star chart of the surrounding systems. With a few quick gestures, she overlaid projected enemy movements and the locations of nearby fleet stations. Their formation is tight, which means they're expecting a direct confrontation, she explained, her voice sharp and efficient. If we give them what they want, they'll tear through us like they did the perimeter defenses. But if we can slow them down, force them into a prolonged engagement, we buy time for reinforcements. Torvax's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. You propose a delaying action. Yes, she confirmed. We hit them fast from multiple angles, then retreat before they can focus fire. Make them think we're stronger than we are. If we can keep them occupied long enough, the Council's combined fleets will have time to mobilize. Torvax studied her for a moment, then let out a low, satisfied growl. Perhaps you are not as weak as I assumed, human. Madeline shot him a glare. Don't mistake strategy for strength, Marshal. They're both required to win wars. He chittered in amusement, but inclined his head in acknowledgement. Turning back to the council chamber, Madeline raised her voice. Enough shouting, she snapped. The room fell silent. She stood tall, her hands resting on the control panel. We don't have time for arguments. If we don't act now, this enemy will be at our doorstep within the hour. We have two choices: we fight smart, or we get wiped out. A ripple of uncertainty passed through the gathered delegates. Who leads this counterattack? One of the Rulthari matriarchs asked. Madeline's lips curled into a thin smile. I do. There was a beat of stunned silence, followed by Torvax's deep, rumbling laughter. I look forward to seeing if your boldness matches your skill, human. She didn't waste time with the response. Instead, she opened a direct line to the Fleet Command Center. All available ships, this is Ambassador Carver, she said, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. We are enacting a defensive maneuver. Follow my lead. With that, she turned, her boots echoing against the chamber's metallic floor as she strode toward the exit. 20 minutes later, she was standing on the bridge of the UTS Resolute, Earth's flagship within the Council fleet. The ship's crew bustled around her, preparing for the battle to come. Holographic displays flickered to life, showing the incoming enemy formation. All ships in position? She asked. Affirmative, the tactical officer replied. Zalvioti warships are flanking us on both sides. The Rulthari carriers are moving into position to provide air support. Madeline nodded. Good. The enemy fleet loomed on the main display now, massive and unrelenting. She could feel the tension radiating from her crew, from the entire fleet. First wave approaching firing range, an officer reported. Madeline took a deep breath. Then calmly she said, Open fire. The void of space erupted into chaos. Torpedoes streaked across the blackness, missiles leaving glowing trails of exhaust in their wake. Energy cannons roared, unleashing torrents of plasma that cut through the enemy ranks. The Zalvioti warships charged forward, their heavy armor absorbing the brunt of the initial counterattack. The battle had begun. Madeline's plan was simple: strike fast, disappear, and strike again. She issued orders with machine-like precision, directing ships to harass enemy formations before retreating just out of range. They were never in one place long enough for the invaders to focus fire. And it was working. They're shifting formation, the tactical officer reported. They're trying to compensate, but they're slowing down. Madeline allowed herself a small, grim smile. Keep it up, she said. For the next 30 minutes, the fleet danced through space, executing hit-and-run strikes that chipped away at the enemy forces. It wasn't about winning, it was about survival. But the enemy wasn't stupid. They're adapting, Torvax growled over the comms. Their formations are adjusting faster. We won't be able to keep this up forever. Madeline knew he was right. The enemy was learning. If they didn't change tactics soon, they would be overwhelmed. Then, a new alert blared through the bridge. Commander, we're detecting a new energy signature. Before the officer could finish, a massive shockwave rocked the Resolute. Alarms screamed. Holographic displays flickered wildly. What the hell was that? Madeline demanded. The officer's face went pale. He swallowed hard. They just deployed a superweapon. Madeline's breath caught. On the display, the enemy fleet had shifted. At its center, a massive warship was charging a weapon unlike anything she had ever seen. Energy readings spiked off the charts. We need to move. Now. Torvax's voice crackled over the comms. I hope you have another brilliant plan, human. Madeline's jaw tightened. She did. But it was going to be risky as hell. And if it failed, they were all dead. The UTS Resolute lurched violently, its reinforced hull groaning under the strain of the shockwave. Madeline barely kept her footing as the bridge tilted, warning klaxons blaring in every direction. The view screen flickered, the battlefield outside illuminated by the pulsing energy of the enemy's superweapon. "Status report," she barked. "Shields down to 34%. The tactical officer shouted over the chaos. "That blast wasn't a direct hit, but if we take another one like that, we won't survive," Madeline finished for him. On the main display, the enemy flagship loomed in the distance, its hull adorned with intricate, glowing patterns that pulsed as the superweapon recharged. Their fleet had suffered from the counterattack, but it wasn't enough. The enemy was adapting faster than expected, shifting their formations, anticipating movements. The Council fleet had played their hand, and now they were running out of options. And out of time. Torvax's face flickered onto the holocom, his expression unusually grim. "Your delaying tactics have bought us time, but we will not last much longer. Their flagship must be destroyed before it fires again." Madeline clenched her fists. That much was obvious. The problem was how. They had nothing capable of penetrating that ship's defenses. Its energy shielding was unlike anything in the Council's records, absorbing entire barrages of weapons fire without flinching. If they were going to take it down, they needed something unconventional, something reckless. Her mind raced, scanning the tactical data, searching for anything, any weakness, any pattern, any flaw in their defenses. And then she saw it. "The energy readings," she muttered, stepping closer to the display. "That weapon, it's not just charging up. It's pulling power from the entire ship's core." Torvax narrowed his multifaceted eyes. "What are you suggesting?" Madeline's pulse quickened. "Their weapon is drawing so much energy, it's overloading their shielding systems. That's why they're not moving. If we hit them at the exact moment they fire." The realization hit Torvax at the same time. His mandibles clicked in approval. "Then they will have no defenses." Madeline nodded. "We won't get a better shot than this." The enemy flagship had become a fortress, but in doing so, it had left itself vulnerable. It had one purpose: to destroy them in a single decisive strike. But if they turned that power against them, they could end this. She turned to her crew. "Prepare for a full-scale assault. We need every available ship to target that vessel the second their weapon fires." The communications officer hesitated. "But Commander, if we miscalculate, we don't have a choice." Madeline's voice was firm, but not unkind. "This is our only chance." A long silence. Then her crew snapped into motion. Across the fleet, ships repositioned, realigning their weapons to target the enemy flagship. The Zalvioti warships moved into formation, their armor absorbing enemy fire as they prepared to strike. The Rulthari carriers hung back, ready to deploy their last waves of fighters. Madeline turned back to Torvax. "Can your ships hold the line?" Torvax's mandibles curled into something close to a smirk. "We will do what we must." She gave him a sharp nod, then refocused on the battle. The enemy flagship continued to glow, the superweapon's energy buildup reaching critical mass. The moment was coming. "All ships stand by," she ordered. The air was thick with tension. The countdown on the tactical display reached its final moments. Madeline held her breath. Then, the enemy weapon fired. A searing column of energy erupted from the flagship, cutting through space like a vengeful god's judgment. The beam sliced through the void, tearing apart a section of a Council warship in an instant before dissipating. But as Madeline had predicted, the flagship's shields flickered, just for a second. A single second. But it was enough. "Now," she roared. The fleet responded in unison. A barrage of missiles, torpedoes, and high-energy blasts surged forward, converging on the enemy flagship. The Zalvioti warships led the charge, their heaviest weapons unleashed in a concentrated, devastating salvo. The Rulthari fighters dove in like furious wasps, firing precision strikes at the ship's exposed hull. Madeline clenched her fists. "Come on." For an instant, it seemed as though the ship might withstand it. Its armor held, its structure refusing to buckle. Then, a ripple, a deep, growing tremor spread across its surface. The glow of its weapon flickered erratically. The ship convulsed, its hull cracking under the pressure of its own destabilized energy. And then, it exploded. A massive shockwave rippled outward, debris scattering in every direction. The enemy fleet faltered as their flagship, once their greatest weapon, was reduced to fragments. Madeline exhaled, her muscles releasing tension she hadn't even realized she was holding. The enemy fleet hesitated. For the first time they seemed uncertain. And then they began to retreat. Torvax's laughter echoed over the comms. They are running. Madeline allowed herself a small smile. They just lost their trump card. Without it they know they can't win. Victory. It wasn't total. The enemy fleet still existed, and they would no doubt return. But for now the council had survived. As the remaining ships scattered into hyperspace, Madeline turned away from the view screen and let out a slow breath. The battle was over. But the war? That was only beginning. The wreckage of the enemy flagship still burned in the darkness of space, fragments of its once imposing hull scattered across the battlefield. The retreating remnants of the hostile fleet had already vanished into the void, their ships streaking into hyperspace one by one. What had started as an inevitable massacre had ended in their humiliation. The UTS Resolute's bridge was quieter now, but the weight of the battle still hung heavy in the air. The adrenaline that had carried the crew through the fight was beginning to wear off, replaced by exhaustion and the slow realization of what had just happened. Madeline Carver stood at the center of it all, her gaze still fixed on the main display. Victory. It tasted like iron in her mouth, sharp and unyielding. They had survived, but she knew better than to celebrate too soon. The enemy would be back. The only question was when. A flickering holoscreen brought her back to the present as High Marshal Torvax's face reappeared, his expression unreadable. For the first time, there was no trace of condescension, no dismissive arrogance in his multifaceted eyes. You fought well, human, he admitted. Better than I expected. Madeline crossed her arms. Funny how that works, isn't it? Torvax clicked his mandibles, the Zalvioti equivalent of a chuckle. Perhaps I misjudged your people. You misjudged half of my people, she corrected, her tone even. His eyes flickered with understanding. A long pause stretched between them before he finally inclined his head. It seems I did. Madeline wasn't in the mood for smug satisfaction. Not now, with so much still at stake. But she couldn't deny the significance of what had just happened. The Zalvioti, a race that prided itself on strength, had been forced to acknowledge Earth's place in the galaxy. More importantly, they had been forced to acknowledge her. Torvax glanced to the wreckage on the view screen. This enemy, we do not know their name, nor their true numbers. But they will return. Madeline nodded grimly. I know. The next battle will not be so easily won. I know that too. Torvax studied her for a moment longer before letting out a deep, satisfied growl. Then I look forward to seeing how you fight next time. With that, the holocom blinked off. Madeline let out a slow breath. She had just earned the respect of one of the most formidable military leaders in the council. It wouldn't solve everything overnight, but it was a start. She turned back to her crew, who were already assessing the damage and coordinating rescue efforts for the surviving ships. Status report, she called. The tactical officer straightened. We lost 5 ships, but casualties are lower than projected. Most of our remaining fleet is intact, though heavily damaged. Madeline nodded. Give me a full casualty count. I want to know who we lost and who needs help. Aye, Commander. She turned her attention back to the wreckage outside. The battle was over, but there was still work to be done. Hours later, after the immediate crisis had been dealt with, Madeline found herself in the council chamber once more. It was eerily silent compared to the chaos of before. The delegates who had once doubted Earth's strength now sat in quiet contemplation, their expressions ranging from grudging respect to outright admiration. The Rulthari matriarchs were the first to speak. You fought with cunning and ferocity, their leader said, her mandibles clicking approvingly. We recognize the worth of your warriors. A murmured agreement spread through the room. Even those who had been skeptical of Earth's military capabilities now saw the truth. The humans were not to be underestimated. Madeline met their gazes evenly. We did what was necessary, she said simply. One of the Giovanni, the Serpentine diplomats who had watched the earlier debate with amusement, slithered forward. I believe this concludes the earlier discussion on human women and war. Does it not? Madeline didn't smirk. Not quite. But she did raise an eyebrow. Torvax, to his credit, didn't attempt to argue. He simply inclined his head, acknowledging what they both knew. He had been wrong. The council's leader, an ancient luminescent being known as the Vathari Prime, spoke at last. Their voice resonated through the chamber like an echo across time. Earth has proven itself today, the Vathari intoned. Not merely in strength, but in strategy, in leadership, in resolve. Their glowing form pulsed softly. We will stand together in the battles to come. Madeline gave a short nod. We'll be ready. The meeting concluded soon after, and as the delegates dispersed, she finally allowed herself a moment of stillness. A quiet victory, not just for her, not just for Earth, but for every woman who had ever been told she wasn't strong enough. For every warrior whose name had been erased from history. For every fighter who had ever bled, fought, and refused to be forgotten. They had never feared war. And now the galaxy knew it.